Hi, welcome to the Neighborhood Potter. I'm Liz Perfetti, and today we're going to be talking about throwing taller forms. In one of my past episodes, we talked about throwing mugs, which work with about a pound to a pound and a half maybe of clay if you have a very large mug. But I wanted to try to challenge us today to throw something taller. So when I was first in school, one of my first lessons was to throw a 12-inch cylinder. I'm still not sure I can get that tall, but these are fairly large. They're probably getting close to that, maybe not this one. But I'm going to try to discuss and try to show with you how to do it to the best of my abilities. These are some of my forms. So one of the things I'd like to sort of point out is the difference between if I wanted to make a pitcher with sort of a volume that's kind of holding the weight down kind of lower, as opposed to a vase where sometimes you want to get the weight up higher, or vice versa. It depends on how you want these pots to be. So I'm going to try throwing a couple of different forms on the wheel, and then we'll show you how to sort of stretch that clay and get the volume, and maybe even put a spout on and a handle later that goes on a little differently than a mug. Not too differently, but it's a little different shape and the considerations are a little different. So why don't you join me at the wheel, and I'll show you to the best of my abilities how to throw. So here I am. I have 5 pounds of clay this time, which is a much larger piece of clay than that mug that I started with on another episode. And I, just like with a bowl, I like to sort of tap it to get it mostly in a roundish shape to start with, because just like with that bowl, I'm centering 5 pounds of clay. So that's a lot of clay. But this time, I want to get the clay up tall. So first things first, getting the clay nice and wet, and that centering, that's always an issue. So we're going to work nice and hard at it. You saw me recycling clay in another episode, and this clay is some of the clay that I used in recycling. So it's quite soft, because as I recycled it, I left it to not get too hard on that plaster. I really like to use a soft piece of clay when I'm throwing tall. Not real gooey soft, but just soft enough. It helps me move the clay easier without too much stress. So I'm just pressing this clay onto center. Sometimes when you're trying to center a large piece of clay, people do this. It's called coning in, coning up. And you push the clay up into a cone, and then you can push it back down. By doing this, you help to compress the clay further and perhaps center the interior of the clay. So this piece of clay is looking pretty centered to me. Again, don't pay attention to this bat that's going around, and it can look a little wobbly. But this piece of clay is not wobbling, at least not much. So I'm going to start by making my opening. I'm going to go down on the inside of the clay, nice and firm. I want to leave only maybe a 1/4 of an inch of clay down there, because these pots are not going to be trimmed later. So I want to use every bit of clay that I have. So I'm trying to be very mindful that the clay is not too thick down there. With a bowl, knowing that I'm going to trim a foot, I might use this much clay. But with these, I'm going to leave just a nice sturdy bottom, but not a ton of clay to remove later. I still want to make sure that I compress the interior of the clay. So by going back and forth gently, and I like to use my sponge, I'm trying to get a nice flat bottom and really get this to sit well on the table, because this is going to be one of my last chances to really work down on the inside of that pot. Now, because I want this clay to get tall, I really want to make sure that the interior circle is not too big. If I go really wide, I'm going to be using all of that clay up down there, and then I'm not going to get the height that I want or the proportions I want later. So I'm trying to keep the interior about this size. I mean, that can vary a little depending on what you're making, but if I want to make something tall and relatively narrow, that I want to keep the base there. Again, I won't be trimming this extra clay off on the outside, so I need to use all the clay that I have to get the height. So this piece of clay is opened with a bottom now, and I'm going to start to bring up the sides. The first thing I'm going to do is press very hard on the very bottom of the clay, and I'm going to push the clay in towards the center as well as drag it up a little bit. Not so much looking for the height yet as setting it up into this sort of cone shape. The clay naturally, because of its spinning, will gladly pull itself out with any pressure. But in order to get it up tall, I need to keep it in nice and tight into a cone shape so that when I'm ready to expand the clay, it's there for me. It's very difficult to go back in later. So I'm going to try to really fight that force the whole way. So that was my first pull. Here's my second pull. This time I'm working on height. And I'm going to take my time bringing this roll of clay up. There's not so much speed when you start working tall. It's definitely a slower, gradual motion. Pulling that clay, feeling it get thinner in my hands. As I come up to the top, I'm just trying to lessen my pressure so I'm not causing too much torquing on this part so that it gets kind of ripply, and I also want to make sure that it doesn't get too thin on the top, especially if I want to make a spout on it later for a pitcher. I need to have that clay there to use for that spout. So I'm going to go back in and make one more gentle pull just to make sure that I have as much clay up where I want it, but I'm not going to be doing too much more as far as height on this. From here on in, after this pull, it's going to be all about shaping. All right. So I think that clay is about the thickness that I want it. I've left it just a little bit thicker than it's going to end up in the end, and the reason for that is that I want this clay to have the ability to expand, and if I take all the clay away, when I go to stretch it out to get that volume, I'm going to make it too thin and it could collapse on me. So one of the things I like to do at this point is trim away this clay that was supporting it down on the bottom that I didn't use. Again, I will not be trimming these later by turning them upside down and taking away the extra clay. So this is sort of the time where I'm going to start to form the foot and get any extra clay out. I'm going to actually go in and create a little line under there. I might reinforce that again later, but I like to get that foot going before I do anything else. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to use my metal rib. These are not fancy, but one of my favorite tools for really shaping as well as removing information that I don't want left behind. So the first thing I'm going to do is just start to give it the essence of a form. By moving my hands around in the inside and having this rib follow it, I can start to already define where I want the curve. So the first piece, I guess I'll make this a pitcher. So pitchers and vases are not completely interchangeable, but those tall cylinder aspects are. So watch how I'm going to bulge out this volume in here. So I'm using this tool to start to round the side of the form, and my hand is on the inside pressing, and I'm using it to really help define the volume and stretch the clay thinner so that I have more space for your fluid that you're going to be putting in there, whether it's a big pitcher full of water or sangria. We want the weight to be about what you're filling it with, not the weight of the clay. So I'm really trying to stretch the clay as much as I can to be the proper thickness, and also, of course, to look at the form. I like to really look at the edge of these forms. I like to see a nice curve. So you notice that I haven't done too much with the top, just kind of hanging it out there for a minute. So I'm getting pretty satisfied with what I have in here. I don't want to overwork it and fuss it and get it to start to collapse on me or anything. So at this point I'm going to start to address the top. Now this favorite little tool also has this end here that's just a little softer circle, smaller circular shape, curve. And I'm going to just use it to just subtly define. I can also use it to put a real distinct line in it right here, which can be fun for decorating purposes later. Places for that glaze to sort of run on. And I'm just going to get this sort of rounded off and smooth. This could stay as a vase, but I am going to let the clay set up a little bit and go ahead and make it into a pitcher. And I'm going to use some of this extra clay that I've left here to bring it up and create more of a fluid spout coming up off of it. So for now, this piece of clay, this pot, has to rest and stiffen up for a few minutes so that it's not quite as sticky and soft when I go to work with it next. All right, I'm going to put it over there to dry. All right, I'm going to try one more time to make a different pot. This time I'm going to work on it being a vase. So I'm going to try to keep that shape tall again, but this time it's going to have a little bit different form. Just trying to think about where I put those curves and edges to show you the difference. So I don't make any of my pots the same. I have a certain language I like to think that my work has, but I enjoy the variations that I can get on the wheel, and I enjoy making something and then thinking, oh, that was nice. How else could I do this differently? So you won't find any of my pieces being exactly alike. It's just not a process that I'm interested in doing. So once again, I'm centering the clay. I'll show you that coning again. I don't do this for smaller objects, but for bigger pieces, it can be helpful, especially when that clay could possibly have still a little bit of inconsistency from being recycled. Plus, it's kind of fun to watch. At least I think so. All right, gonna make that opening. Again, not making the circle on the inside too wide. And compressing. Now bringing the sides up. And keeping that top in fairly small so that I can make my choices of what I want to do with it later without it having made the choice for me by getting too wide. So, is this my second pull? I think so. Generally, my pots come up in 3 to 4 big pulls, and then after that it's really the shaping that I do with quite a bit less water and pressing. So this is coming up to one of the last pulls. The clay is thinning out. It also gets a little wobbly. You can kind of see it down there. It's sort of my telltale sign that I've done enough. Come up. Without even thinking about it, I just kind of gently have been compressing this rim. I've mentioned leaving the clay a little extra thick right up here so that I can make decisions about it. But one of the things that's really important is to make sure that we do soft, sort of round and compress this clay. When people are first beginning, they tend to throw the clay very, very thin up here, and then they'll get something called a rim crack. And it's when you have a crack in a piece of pottery you've been making, there really is no way to fix that crack. So trying to avoid them is the best. There's lots of things people will do to try to fix them, but my theory is to try not to get them in the first place. So I like to really be mindful of that. Once again, here I am with my wooden tool trimming off this extra clay. My hand can't reach all the way down on the inside, so I'm trying to use a little bit, I'm a little more gentle, because generally I like to keep my hands so that they're always connected and touching one another, but as I'm throwing taller, that becomes impossible. So being really gentle with my touch is very important, and stabilizing myself any way I can, whether it's my elbows on my knees or by touching my other hands together when they can. That's an important skill to trying to get this pot to behave itself and become what I want it to be, and not what not some random blob. So okay, so again, I'm shaping up that foot to start with. I like to leave a little shadow under the pot. You might see me doing that. This little line under here, it does a couple of purposes. One, when I go to use a wire to take this pot up later, it's going to keep it from accidentally slicing through higher up the pot and maybe losing the bottom, but it also visually gives it a much nicer look when it's sitting on the table, and I'll show you the difference. So when it was just kind of sitting down here like this, you know, it's okay, but if you were looking at that on your table, it looks a little gloomy. I don't know, it doesn't have any height to it. So it's an amazing thing to just take the tip of your tool and put a little line under there, and it lifts the whole image, whole pot up, and it gives a sense of it not weighing as much, not being so grounded. So it's just a little thing I like to keep on my pot. It's the way I finish a pot that's not going to be trimmed. So here I am. I'm going to start shaping this, and this time I'm going to make it a vase. So I'm going to change the proportions. So here we go. I'm going to just make the curve down here start to have some volume, but I'm stopping at about a 3/4 mark, maybe a third. One of the things you want to avoid is halfway. Half proportions tend to look, I don't know, boring. So most artists try to think about it in thirds as sort of a way to break up, whether you're breaking up a flat image or a three-dimensional image. Changing that proportions up a little bit can be really pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to have this be a little more flared open, but I still want a bit of a neck in there so that if I was to arrange flowers, I wouldn't need quite so many, and it would give a nice spray. You would get a little more volume. One of the things that bug me is if the proportions of the size of what I call this, the belly, and then to the shoulder, is a little off, and this starts to look a little short-legged. And that kind of bugs me. It feels a little bit like it does that for me right now, but I'm going to try to tweak it. So, sort of an interesting thing. We could talk about the anatomy of the pot. This is the foot. And then as we come up in here, we talk about this being the belly, and this the shoulder, and the neck. And then we go back to rim. So it has some body parts, which is sort of interesting, because sometimes when pots are all lined up on the shelf, I think they do take on a certain personality. So I'm going to go in and get the extra water out of there. Again, extra water hanging out in the bottom can cause cracking too. So from the rim to the interior of the pot, we're always thinking about ways to make this clay do what we want and be successful. Finishing the foot again, reinforcing that edge. Okay, So this is a vase. I'm going to bring back over the pitcher form that I threw earlier. And you can see sort of the differences of how I divided the space up. This one would probably not look good with a spout. I don't think it would function well, and it wouldn't pour well. But this one, because I kept this a little narrower, a little shorter in here, I think it's going to take to a spout quite well. All right, we're going to let those set up so that I can get the spout on there for you. So this pot that I made a little while ago has set up just enough that it's still quite soft and flexible, but my fingers are not leaving wet, gooey fingerprints. So here is where I'm going to start to stretch some clay up to make a pouring spout for a pitcher. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. So here's one, and here's another. I'll move them out of your way in a moment. So, of course, I'm getting clay hands on my work, but that's okay. At least they wash off. All right, so here is how, there's many different ways to make a spout, but this is one of my favorites. I like to get a little extra volume up off of the rim than instead of just sort of pulling the spout out. So I'm going to get it a little damp, and I'm going to try to, so you can see it as well. I'm going to start by pulling the clay towards the center and picking the clay up. So my motion is like this, and I'm trying to be very soft and gentle, very much like when I'm pulling the clay up on the wheel. I'm going to be just pulling, and I'm easing clay from the sides up into the middle of the spout so that the very center of the spout will hopefully have the highest peak. I'm just skirting away on me a little bit. So I'm just going to pull that up. And I'm trying to take my care on this edge here to not pull right up and off of it. I sort of stop just as I get there so that I'm not going to make it so thin that it will rip apart, if I can help it. There's one nice thing about doing these is that when they become harder in the leather hard clay stage, I can come back in and kind of clean them up further. But now I'm going to take that, I'm just kind of looking at where all of the clay is and seeing if I have as much height as I can get. One of the reasons I know it's time to stop is if the clay starts to get a little too wiggly and soft on me, then I'm thinking, okay, it's time to stop because it will collapse or do something unpleasant. So now I'm going to give it a shape. I'm going to start by using my sponge to get some of those fingerprints out, and I'm going to pull it in and round it off here and give it a nice lip. One of the things that I was told, and I don't know if this is really true, but if you make a nice edge in here, the pitcher won't drip. And I think that it does help because I've been told my pitchers pour well. So I'm just going to fuss on that for another second. And I'm going to leave this to dry up a little further until I can attack it and put that handle on. It needs to sort of set back up again. So now this pot has had a little more time to dry, and the clay is much stiffer. It holds its shape, and if I was to try to bend it or move it too much, it would probably crack or crumble at this stage. I would not want to try to change the form too much, but it is at a good consistency for adding on a handle, so that's what I'm going to do next. I want to make sure that I consider where the handle is going to go. I like to think about the space where this break is as a good place to put my handle because I want my hand to fit comfortably in there without feeling cramped, but also without having to have the handle be too big off the side of the pot. So, for instance, if I attached it way down here, I would have this bulge to contend with my hands, which could become kind of awkward, and it would also result in having to have a much larger handle. I like to keep them close to the pot as possible, but still comfortable. So I think we're going to be working off the top just looking at this curve here. So I'm going to just take the surface where I want this handle to attach, and one of the things that's really important is to pay attention to lining it up directly across the spout. Nobody wants their handle on in a weird crooked direction. So I'm just going to scratch the surface. That makes for a good place for the clay to attach later. And then somewhere right down in here, I'm going to scratch again. I'll clean these scratches up later. The scratches, they act a little bit like the surface of the bottom of your shoes when it's icy or slippery, and it helps cause some grip. And it also helps this is our slip, which is watery clay, and it helps this slip sort of go in deeper into the clay. Since the clay is now a little harder, we really want to have that sticky surface, that slip, to act as our glue. This is the handle that I made a little while ago, and it's just also stiff enough that it bends, but not to leave fingerprints. So I am going to start by looking at the shape. I'm going to put the heavier part of the handle down on the bottom. So the first thing I'm going to do is just going to trim away a little bit of this top to get a nice clean edge. And then I'm going to use my back of my tool to sort of create those sucky lip shapes that I like, that helps me get it attached. Now, it's never perfectly even in my hand when I make it in my hands, so I tend to just kind of look at it and think, which way is it going to look best when it goes on the pot? Up this way or this way? I don't know how to tell you how I decide, except for I think this way looks best today. So I'm going to put it on. I'm going to turn it towards me to make sure that it's right, even on the pot, and I'm going to give it a little push on. And then I'm going to turn this handle around, and I want to trim off some of that extra. And then I'm going to start to sort of look at the profile and the shape. And if I need to trim a little extra away again, I will. If I start, because this handle was a little bit dry sitting here waiting for me to use it, if I start to see a few little cracks develop, I can just soften them with a tiny bit of water. I'm going to just looking at that shape again. Okay, I'm going to press it on, and I don't want this extra flap in here, so I'm going to trim that away. And now I'm going to just smooth in these lines so that it doesn't look messy later. When this pot is very dry, I sometimes come in and do a little more cleaning up. But for now, I want to just use my tip of my finger and a little water, and I'm just going to make this line nice and clean and attractive. I like the friction of just a coarse sponge sometimes. It acts like a piece of fine sandpaper to me to sort of help move away any of these scratchy lines that I made. Just going to blend that in. And lastly, I'm going to grab a brush, and I'm just going to get in here and soften this up where I can't quite reach with my fingers or a sponge. Take one good last look at it, decide how I like it and if I like it and where I could fix it. And from there, I think I'll let this set up further, and then maybe later on another time, I'll show you how I do my carving into it to get some of the lines that I get, but it has to be harder yet to do that. So thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to showing you more things to do with clay, and have a great day.